to The Green Rush, a podcast about the business of cannabis. On a weekly basis, hosts Ann Donahoe and Louis Goldberg talk with the CEOs, politicians, and cultural icons driving the cannabis industry forward. This week, Ann and Louis speak with Taylor West, Senior Communications Director for COHNNABIS, a marijuana industry branding and marketing company. Taylor is also the former Deputy Director of the National Cannabis Industry Association. As you probably know, The Green Rush is part of the MJ Today media family of podcasts, which includes shows like Marijuana Today, where Taylor appears as one of our longtime regulars. By the way, if you're not listening to Marijuana Today or Marijuana Today Daily, you really should. It's a great compliment to The Green Rush. But before we get into our discussion with Taylor, we have friend of The Green Rush, Alan Brochstein, founder of New Cannabis Ventures and the 420 Investor app, catching us up on things he thinks we should all be paying better attention to. Don't sit back, lean forward. And now, onto the show. So before we get to our interview today with Taylor West, we have another returning champion, a longtime friend of the pod, Alan Brochstein, founder of New Cannabis Ventures and the amazing 420 Investor app. Alan, as you all know, is the voice of the retail investor. So, AB, what's the big story that's undercovered? What should we all be paying attention to?
Yeah, well, first let me say it's always an honor to be part of this, and especially with Taylor West to follow.
Yeah, she's awesome.
So I think one of the really interesting stories, I'm worn out. Today, we're taping this on at the end of earnings season, and I have to say I'm totally exhausted. You may not hear it in my voice, but in some ways I'm kind of agitated because I'm trying to catch up, and I'm a little bit embarrassed, but it's just not humanly possible. So part of the big story is just how many companies are reporting massive revenue. But the part of the story I want to hone in on today is kind of a new trend. And I've been following the space for 5.5 years. And, we're starting to see conference calls, which is really nice. I know you guys are really busy with that, Louis, as part of that. But the part that really stands out is guidance. And there's been a few cases of guidance over the years, and oftentimes a company would put up guidance. It was just a handful, and then they would stop doing it in the future for whatever reason. And I would note that the Canadian LPs have never given guidance, which is a little bit annoying because it's a way to measure companies, and they don't have to just give revenue guidance. They could give margin guidance, all sorts of guidance. But retail investors and institutional investors do like to see revenue guidance. And so the thing I think people are missing is that we have some companies that are willing to put some big numbers out there. And I hope I'm not skipping any, but the three that we learned about since I spoke to you last, and both of these are in the last 2 weeks, have been Trulieve, Curaleaf, which I believe is a client of yours, if I'm not mistaken, and KushCo, which is a client of yours. So these three companies, hey, maybe, Louis, you guys are advising them to do this. I don't know.
We are.
You are? Okay. So just for the listeners, the numbers are quite impressive, and they're so big that they need explanation. And I think that's the part that's really of value. I mean, anybody can put a number out there, and I've been seeing these presentations for the last few years about these companies that have zero revenue and they're going to do $1 billion or whatever it is. I'm exaggerating, but these hockey stick type of numbers, but they're very hard to have faith in. And so all three of these companies, I think, have done a reasonable job of not only giving the guidance, and off the top of my head, I think KushCo was 110 to 120 million after generating 52 million this year. Curaleaf, 400 million next year with 100 million in EBITDA. So they were the only ones that gave that additional item. And then Trulieve, well, they have it on their site and they just said refer to it. And I don't know if it's updated, but I believe 214 million. They actually have 214.3 million to be precise for next year. And that's just in Florida. And so it wasn't only so much that these companies had the confidence to share their forecasts, and obviously they're just forecasts, but I appreciated that each of these companies, I thought, did a reasonable job of explaining how they're going to get there. So I think that's the big story, and it's reflects the evolution of the sector and how cannabis companies are becoming more normalized.
That was fantastic, as per usual. And Alan, we will put links to both New Cannabis Ventures and 420 Investor app in the show notes. And we'll talk again in a couple weeks.
Thanks a lot, Louis.
Taylor, thank you so much for joining us.
I am happy to be here.
So we first met a couple weeks ago in Las Vegas at the Marijuana Today kind of all-star podcast that Shay put together. And by the way, side note to our listeners, if you haven't actually listened to that show, you really should, and we'll put a link to it in our show notes. And while Ann and Nick and I, were a part of that panel, we felt so outclassed by everybody else. I mean, you guys are all these lions in the history of the cannabis legalization movement, and you are a pioneer. And you guys were all so nice to us. I mean, we felt like posers, and it's been really cool to be a part of the Marijuana Today family. And I know Ann and I have been very much looking forward to this conversation.
Well, me too. And if it makes you feel any better, I actually don't consider myself in the same class as several of the other regulars on that podcast. I guess I've been in the industry now for almost 5 whole years, which is a lifetime in cannabis, I guess. But some of those folks have been working on the front lines for much longer than that. And I am always excited and proud to be able to sit alongside them and like you, benefit from their experience.
Yeah, it was an awesome conversation. When both Louis and I looked at each other like, we don't belong here. And I wish I had a notebook. Like, I wish I was taking notes when, both Chris's were talking and you were talking, and all, it just was an amazing show. So definitely download it if you haven't had the time to listen to it yet. But before we get into what you're doing now, Taylor, you have a really deep and interesting background in drug policy reform. Can you take us through that, and maybe that will cover your cannabis resume?
Yeah, sure. So my very first kind of interactions with drug policy started oddly enough, when I was in high school. I got very interested out of the blue in the concept of what are syringe exchange programs, essentially HIV prevention through syringe exchange for intravenous drug users. Honestly, it was one of these. I heard an NPR story, and the concept seemed such an obvious smart public policy move to me as a super worldly 17-year-old that I got a little obsessed with it. And so after my freshman year of college, I wanted to intern with an organization that dealt with issues like that, and kind of stumbled across an organization called the Drug Reform Coordination Network, or DRCnet. It's now called StopTheDrugWar.org, and Dave Borden is the founder and the head. And Dave is doing amazing work these days, especially on international drug policy and how the U.S. And the UN interact with the drug policy things that are happening here in the States. But anyway, that was an amazing experience for me, that I got to dive into all of these issues around drug policy. And then on top of that, one of my fellow interns was a guy named Chris Lotlicker. For folks who are familiar with sort of larger drug policy movement, Chris is one of the co-founders of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I was around when that was conceived. I cannot claim any substantive contribution to that effort, but I certainly remember it coming together and being so impressed by folks like Chris and our producer Shay and others who
the 2 tallest men in cannabis.
Oh my God. And since I am one of the shortest women in cannabis, you two are a little tough for me to be around. But that was kind of my entree into issues around drug policy, advocates around drug policy. And then I kind of left it for a while. I got into more general politics. I started working on campaigns starting in the sort of early 2000s. Spent a few years in my 20s really just traveling around to work on whatever campaign I could find, and got some amazing experiences that way. I worked on campaigns in Georgia and Virginia and Iowa and Colorado. And I like to tell people that I am so glad that I did that and so glad that I am not doing it anymore.
Well, it's funny. I think you and I share a similar disorder. It's PTSD. It's political traumatic stress disorder. 'Cause
Exactly.
I worked in the Senate for a senator for a couple of years as his state press secretary, and I did campaigns, and I will never, ever do that again. I love politics, but it's like an arm's length thing. Like, you guys stay over there. I'm going to stay over here. I'm going to shake my head and write some checks, and we'll call it even. But your history in politics is really interesting, and you have used it to help shape the way that drug policy has happened and the cannabis legalization movement has progressed. What's been the most surprising thing about this whole journey for you? You know, when you look at where we are today, and you look back and you're like, how the hell did we get here? Like, what has like caused you the biggest head scratching moment?
You know, I think in some ways the thing that, if I really take a step back and look at it, the thing that's most surprising is truly how quickly everything suddenly changed. And that isn't to say that there wasn't a tremendous amount of work before that moment, because there was. A switch didn't just flip. And in fact, that whole 2-hour podcast that we recorded in Vegas spends a lot of time talking about the work that went into that moment that seemed like an overnight success. But still, even so, every other sort of public policy situation in the last few years has largely been defined by increasing partisanship, increasing conflict, and lack of movement. And cannabis policy is one of the few areas where we've actually seen folks from both parties finding some common ground. We've seen positive movement forward. And, it's also a great example of an issue that is being powered by people and voters ahead of elected officials, which is also an awesome thing to see. It doesn't happen nearly as often as it should these days.
So do you think that is reflective of the issue, or do you think that it's actually more reflective of where the country is and that politicians are much more divided because of who they are, or are they reflecting what the real will of the country is?
I think it's a little bit of a combo. Certainly one of the most important dynamics is popular opinion and the way it's changed around cannabis legalization. And there are lots of factors that play into that, including very successful efforts on the part of advocates who have crafted a message that works and worked extremely hard to educate people out of the propaganda that we were all bombarded with over the last several decades. So that's been an incredible piece of work that has resulted in an amazing amount of progress. I think it's also the case that the messaging has found a way to appeal to philosophies from both parties. And this is kind of where I think my political background has been a cool foundation for me as I have moved back into the cannabis space. Is as I was beginning to work in cannabis at the beginning of 2014, I really saw and did my part to the extent that I could to encourage a movement toward talking about cannabis as a federalist issue, as a independent liberty issue. And that was where we started to see an incredible amount of progress on the Republican side of the aisle, where you could start to pick off Republican members who really weren't super committed to the idea of prohibition, but didn't feel like they had a safe place to land where they wouldn't be tagged as soft on crime or otherwise, going against social conservatives. This space that was not about progressive values and liberalism so much as it was about small government and states' rights really gave them a safe platform to stand on, and that made a huge difference in some of our successes in Washington.
So Taylor, if you could channel your inner guru for a moment. I know you're not in politics at this moment. Do you have any predictions on what you think is going to happen with the new Congress next year? Is the States Act going to finally pass? What do you see in your crystal ball?
So, unfortunately, I have to say the most likely scenario is that not a whole lot happens. Not just on cannabis, but on everything. I think we're going to see a Congress that is very tied up in conflict. The House is chomping at the bit to start some investigations into the various issues of the Trump administration. The Senate is not going to be incentivized to move forward on bills that are being passed by a Democratic House. The president is not going to be incentivized to sign bills that he sees as giving any kind of victory to Democrats.
I don't think he's going to be the president.
There is that possibility. So, as much as I could be wrong about this, obviously, but there is certainly a small chance and a better chance on cannabis than on many issues that we will see some kind of progress. But it's still a small chance, even given all of the progress that we've made from an ideological standpoint. It's just going to be tough to see anything moving in a Congress that's so deeply divided right now.
So, Louis, before you hop in, I know you have another question here. I want to get to what you're doing now, what your day-to-day business is. Tell our listeners a little bit about what COHNNABIS is, namely what's up with the name. And because then we have other questions that do involve, states, regulations and politics. So we'll get back there, but tell our listeners, viewers, do we have viewers? I don't think so. Tell our listeners.
I hope not. I really, really hope not.
Certainly hope not. Tell our listeners about what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got into cannabis in early 2014 as the deputy director of the National Cannabis Industry Association. And I was there at NCIA for about 3.5 years. And then about a year and a half ago, I decided to kind of jump into a new adventure, and I joined a marketing and brand agency. Our cannabis-focused sort of agency within the agency is COHNNABIS. The parent company, the parent agency is Cone Marketing. So that's what's up with the name. We were Cone Marketing.
Very clever.
And yes. Cone is based in Denver. And back long before I joined the agency, they began working with cannabis clients here in Colorado, starting as early as 2014 when legal adult use sales started in the state. And then after a couple of years of doing that, decided that this was an industry that they really wanted to plant a flag in, make a commitment to. And that led to sort of the concept of COHNNABIS as like I said, sort of an agency within the agency that's focused specifically on cannabis clients. I was familiar with both Cone Marketing and COHNNABIS because Cone Marketing has a great reputation within Denver just as an overall marketing agency, and then also COHNNABIS because they were members of NCIA, and I knew that they were making a real commitment to the industry. So when I started kind of looking around for my next adventure, I reached out to the folks here at COHNNABIS to say, I think this agency does incredible work. There's an incredible amount of marketing savvy here and experience. And I have a lot of cannabis industry background that I'd love to combine with your marketing expertise and really help bring COHNNABIS to the next level in terms of providing the kind of sophisticated marketing that other industries are accustomed to, but that the cannabis industry is still kind of evolving toward.
Well, can we talk about that? Because the cannabis industry is beset by this really odd regulatory system that you have the federal prohibition at the national level, you have states acceptance generally at in 33 states now, but at the local level there are other like really weird restrictions from a marketing perspective. When the goal for marketing is to tell corporate stories in different ways through different vehicles. What are these guys? What are the plant touching companies doing? What are best practices? Are you plowing new ground every day, or What are you doing?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And it is one that still remains a bit open-ended because things are continuing to evolve, but there are an incredible amount of challenges like you're talking about. As you said, a lot of the marketing and advertising regulations go down to the local level. So you're really dealing, first off, with a lot of logistical challenges if you're operating in multiple markets. You've got different rules depending on where you are. It also faces the industry faces a lot of challenges on the digital front. The major sources of digital advertising for most industries are cut off to the cannabis industry. Google AdWords will have nothing to do with you. Facebook will not take your money.
Instagram keeps
Twitter
ripping
and
people
Instagram,
down. Yep.
Absolutely. With Instagram, you at least somewhat have an avenue right now through kind of influencers. As long as you're not directly paying Instagram, they seem less concerned about it. But it's still much more difficult than any other kind of retail product faces. So, how do we approach that? I think some of it depends on your goals. If you are a fairly locally focused, if you're a smaller shop without, multi-market ambitions, then you can focus on kind of local marketing presence. And there are, opportunities in print and some broadcast, some radio or, stations. You have to
Sirius allows you to.
Yep. Sirius is a big one. If you're looking for a national option, Sirius is one of the few, frankly. Locally, like here in the Denver area, there are local radio stations that will take ads, but you do have to have them running during times when the demographics have been identified to be a certain percentage adults, that sort of thing. And the same is true for print publications. They need to be able to show that the majority of their readership is of age. So those are challenges. But I think in the broader sense, if you're a cannabis company and you're faced with these challenges, the important thing to realize is that if you build a really strong brand from the start, then the ways that you have to communicate that brand are nearly endless. And while you might not have access to some of the most obvious traditional channels for marketing, the marketing world we're living in now has just so many more opportunities than it once did. I think of it, like everything, distribution of a message has been democratized. You don't have to go through official channels anymore for media or for music or for, in this case, marketing. You have the opportunity to build your own content channels. So in the general sense for a cannabis company that's looking at their marketing efforts, I think it's critical that you start with a really strong brand and then get your message out there in all the ways that you do have access to, even if they don't necessarily match up with what other industries would be doing.
Plus, I would imagine it just makes sense for you to, kind of have the best practices in mind and almost act as if you're a traditional CPG company or, fill in the blank so that when, deregulation or rescheduling it does happen, you've kind of hit the ground running, you've done the hard work before, and now it's just implementing using these new found channels to you, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think the smartest companies out there right now are planning all of their marketing efforts, their packaging efforts, their product development, their expansion plans, all with a view to 5 or 10 years down the road. And granted, it's a lot easier to do that if you're a company that has capital to work with. And that's a whole other challenge within the industry. You've got your few big players that are starting to really build up that capital. But the reality is that a lot of your mid to small companies don't have that kind of upfront money to make these investments with. Still, if you're smart, you're looking down the road and seeing that the companies that will succeed in the long run are the ones who've set themselves up to work well with regulation, to be nimble, to respond to the fact that regulations are going to be moving around a lot over the next few years. Hopefully they'll eventually stabilize, but look at like Colorado, we're 5 years in, and every year the legislature changes up regulations in one way or another. So you have to be prepared to react to those. And hopefully you're building a strong enough brand with the right kind of appeal so that even as the landscape changes, you have that foundation to build from. And as you're saying, new channels are going to open up to you. I mean, 5 years ago, nobody was thinking about influencer networks. The evolution of, and when you're talking about an industry that has so many restrictions, necessity is the mother of invention. And I think you're going to start to see companies coming up with creative new ways to get their message out there. So, again, I'm not really giving anyone a great step-by-step process for doing this, but the larger point is that if you can start with a strong brand that you have well defined, you know who you are, you know who your audience is, then you can adjust your tactics as more opportunities open up.
Is there a common theme that you hear from clients in new business meetings, or what are the main reasons that brands come to you? For instance, Louis and I sit in a ton of new business meetings, and all of them have, the big ask. And we always say, what's your dream headline? What's your dream story? And for them, it's, I want to be on CNBC, or I want to be in the Wall Street Journal. Do you have, what's the main reason that brands are coming to you? Is there a common theme, or is it just it's too fragmented right now?
Well, there's not necessarily a common theme in the same way that there is for sort of the dream PR success. People, when we talk to them about their sort of brand and marketing goals, it tends to be focused on sales or expansion. Maybe they're looking to expand into a certain number of markets, or they're trying to get into a certain number of dispensaries if they're a product, or they're trying to hit a certain revenue number if they're a B2B provider, which we do a lot of work for. So it's not quite the same concrete goal. But I do know, we get a lot of folks who are trying to figure out how to do a digital marketing strategy, given that there are so many barriers right now. So that's something that we talk to clients about a lot. And the reality is that there's not a simple solution for as long as Google AdWords isn't taking your money. It's not as easy as flipping a switch and putting ads up. But there are ways to boost your organic visibility, and so that's something that we talk to a lot of clients about. The other thing, honestly, that we see quite a bit is companies that have already launched. They think that they have kind of a brand, but what they really have is a name and a logo. And then they get down the road with maybe a website or some sales collateral, and they can't shake the feeling that those materials don't really reflect who they are. And I've had a lot of conversations with potential clients asking them, well, did you go through a brand process? Did you talk about your brand strategy? Did you, work with someone to really dig into what your unique propositions are and what your values as a company are? And in a lot of those cases, they didn't. And not because they're stupid. It's just, one, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of investment, and a lot of these companies are really starting up from a shoestring, but also there's sometimes a misconception about kind of what a brand consists of.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think they don't understand what a brand is, because when we talk about brand, it's really simple. It's what is the perception that somebody has of you before they actually encounter you, before they touch it, taste it, feel it, and then after they've encountered you, how do they describe what that was? That's ultimately how we describe what a brand is. And I think that plays into the challenge that the industry is facing, because you've got this tension between courting the new user. But how do you court the 45-year-old soccer mom who's never smoked before, as well as stay honest and authentic to the longtime user, whether they're 30 and have been smoking since they're in high school illegally, or they're 70 and have been smoking since the 60s. How do you help your brands or your clients kind of navigate the tension between the normalization of the industry versus its historic illicit roots?
Yeah, it really depends on who the client has identified as their target audience. And that's something actually that is an interesting conversation that's going on right now too. For the longest time, obviously, there was sort of the cliched understanding of who the cannabis consumer was, and it's all the stoner cliches and that kind of thing. And then you've seen this very dramatic pendulum swing with a lot of companies that are, they want to break out of that stereotype. They're trying to appeal, as you said, to the soccer moms and that kind of thing. And I think that's great because there's no question that there is a huge potential audience among new or infrequent consumers, sort of showing them how this can be a part of their lifestyle. But I think, like many things, when the pendulum swings, sometimes it can swing too far. And it's really important that companies coming into the space don't overlook the fact that 80% of their consumer base is still more of a young male audience. Now, if you have a product that you think is most appealing to soccer moms and more, older or more novice consumers, that's totally fine. And you can target your marketing at that audience. But you need to make sure that there are enough of those people out there that you as a company, as a business model, can thrive with that being your main audience. Where I think the bigger brands need to find the room to play is in a brand that is accessible to those sort of novice consumers, more women, older consumers, but as you kind of said, still feels authentic to what makes up a much larger proportion of the actual consumer base. One of the things that I think maybe doesn't come through when we talk about the demographics of who cannabis consumers are is while there are definitely a lot of consumers who do not fit the demographic stereotype of the old style cannabis consumer, your heavy consumers are still buying way more. Even if, in numbers, there are fewer of them than there used to be as a proportion of the market, they are still the ones who are making the lion's share of the purchases, and you sort of ignore that market at your peril.
Are there brands either inside or outside of cannabis that you really look up to? Like we really dig what Candescent is doing and what Adrian Sedlin, kind of how he's decided to go about, putting brand so front and center in his strategy. Or maybe give us a brand in the cannabis industry that's really killing it, or one brand outside of it. I guess who are the brands you think that are just making it work?
Yeah, I mean, Candescent's such a great example, and he gets mentioned. Adrian gets mentioned in this context all the time, and for good reason. He really he made the investment in the development of his brand before really many other companies in the space were doing that, and his brand is a great example of how a brand is built on great aesthetics and great design, but that's not the only part of it. He's also been kind of at the forefront in talking about the qualities of his products and getting away from some of the jargon and the strain names and things like that can be really disorienting for newer consumers.
Well, that strain name issue is one that has been something that has driven us nuts.
Yeah.
All the time. And it's funny because, you talk to, our job in the industry is to talk to reporters, and to communicate, brand stories to reporters. Do you think it's inauthentic to not embrace some of the language that undergirds the industry? I mean, we always cringe when we see reporters write about weed or pot or,
right.
Getting stoned. But is that just us trying to be too precious? Should we just not admit what we are?
I don't think so. And I think partly it's because we are still trying to dig cannabis out from the most harmful cliches and stereotypes. And so if we're erring a little on the side of sophistication and away from slang, It's for that reason. It's to elevate the overall concept of the industry and really push back on what has been decades and decades of those sort of cultural stereotypes. I do think there's a way to talk to cannabis consumers that's not stuffy and stodgy. It is a fun product. It can be, and
yes, it is.
and
come on, let's admit it.
Exactly.
It's all the social justice stuff is vital. All the money, and it's all, but it's actually a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it has a social element to it that I think is important for us not to lose sight of. But I think there is kind of that middle ground. I honestly think as the market moves forward, I think strain names are going to become less and less of a guiding factor for people. I don't know that they'll necessarily go away completely, but they're probably going to be relegated to the folks who really like to kind of geek out over their cannabis. But even in that scenario, the science is starting to show us that strain names really don't mean a whole lot.
They are bullshit.
Yeah. And even the sort of indica sativa breakdown, it doesn't mean a whole lot either. And these are ways that people forever have been classifying cannabis, and they're not completely illegitimate, but now that we're able to do so much more with the analysis and the research and the science and the technology that's now in the industry, we don't necessarily have to rely on what is kind of an outdated and genetically inaccurate system.
It drives me nuts, and it just does. It's because it's not. It is holding.
Do you have to disclose it though? Like, do you have? And this is a question I have no idea. Like, so if you're a farmer and you're growing, insert crazy name, Purple Haze Kush, whatever. Like, do you have to say that on your brand that's what is in that? Or I guess Adrian doesn't do that, right, Lewis?
Yeah, no, or
Taylor.
No,
yeah.
he does it by effect,
like
right?
the feeling, right? Yeah.
Well, and there's also a big difference between infused products, extracts, those kinds of things, where you could have quite a mix,
a mishmash,
right. Versus flower. If someone is buying flower, they, at this point, typically are going to want to know what the strain is, and to a certain extent that will probably continue, but I would expect brands to start kind of developing their own, if not strains, then product lines that don't necessarily conform to the old strain designation system. But when you're talking about flower, it's a single source product. When you're talking about extracts and pre-rolls and infused products, edibles, those kinds of things, increasingly, the folks who are making those, not only are you using potentially a mishmash of different plants, but they're also working with the various compounds within the extract and kind of manipulating those through the extract process so that the strain itself becomes much less relevant even than it is when you're talking about an individual flower.
So, we're at towards the end of the conversation, and it's been really awesome. Actually, before we do, while you were sleeping, I want to go back to the very beginning of our conversation when we were talking about that panel that we did. There was a moment where Chris Crane went through, the history of the legalization movement. And it really struck me when he was talking about that, about how long this process took. I mean, we're talking 30 plus years from the point that it really started to tip towards us. You were involved in, both in depth and from the outside looking in. But before you were involved, when you were doing politics and watching this, were you watching it going, these guys are really smart for taking this incremental approach, or were you thinking, God, they're just dumb? Which side were you thinking was the right way to do it?
So I tend to fall more on the incrementalism side, which puts me not as far down the scale on the activism side. But that's why I worked in politics, right? That's kind of you have to be willing to kind of
to get things done.
Yeah,
right.
well, and you have to be willing to accept small change as you go, because otherwise you'll make yourself crazy. No, I actually, watching that from the outside, watching that as a political professional, and I mentioned this a little bit on that earlier podcast, I watched the messaging evolve from one that was very activist focused and very kind of almost protester focused into one that was very smart and sophisticated and understood how to reach people who were not automatically going to be on your side. And that's, that is a complicated process. And always there are things that get lost when you move from sort of pure activism into a certain amount of pragmatism and willingness to compromise. But that willingness to compromise really did move the needle. The willingness to put initiatives on the ballot that had certain either restrictions or not giveaways, but incentives to law enforcement and things like that. It really did make a difference. And once you are successful with one of those initiatives, then the snowball kind of builds. And we've seen that over the last few years as public opinion has changed and initiatives have been successful across the country.
Let's stick with the guru. Go back to that for a second. When do we see federal complete rescheduling or legalization is the wrong word, but when do we see where the federal government says, okay, we're completely out of this? We have.
Yeah, this question comes up a lot, and I'm always loath to put a specific sort of time period on it because God knows none of us would have predicted it to have moved to where it is today. So I think the route that it happens, I think, is through essentially descheduling, like you're talking about, basically the federal government washing their hands of it and saying the states can decide how they want to handle cannabis. Though there is legislation that would do that right now that has been introduced in the House and Senate and could at any point get passed. I don't anticipate that happening as quickly as this session. I think. Oh, if I'm forced to put a number on it, I'm going to say 3 years from now. And even that might be a little optimistic. We might see something like medical go before the full descheduling. I'm not sure. But that's the route that
we're not going to hold you to it.
I know. And it's terrible. I'm sorry. I'm talking around in circles about it.
We're not going to hold you to it. We're so holding you to this.
So in 3 years from this day, if
God.
it's not legal, we're calling you out.
Yeah, come to me.
You are so going to get it. Oh, man. So we've been talking a lot about, this intersection of marketing and regulation and when legalization is going to happen. And we're now at the end of the show, and I want to kind of maybe wrap all this together. We have a segment called where we end, was called While You Were Sleeping, where we ask our guests to say, what is the thing we're missing? Like, what is the media missing? How are we as a culture what are we not paying attention to or talking to about in cannabis? So Taylor, what would you say? What are we missing while we're asleep?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important for both the sort of marketing world around cannabis, for cannabis companies, and then for cannabis consumers is to really start thinking hard about how we are talking about this as a society and especially to kids. Obviously from a marketing standpoint, we don't want to be talking to kids about it at all. But from a family perspective, I think we can look at some mistakes that have been made in our culture, especially American culture, around alcohol, and the way that we, in the past at least, have not really had candid conversations with our kids about it. And it's led to this sort of toxic approach to alcohol where a lot of kids are just never really exposed to it in a healthy way when they're younger. And I don't mean a healthy way like a healthy way of drinking it, but in a in an environment where there are modeled approaches to moderate drinking and how it can be a part of a social setting without being without taking things over. And then they head to college, and then we end up with these insane situations where kids are going crazy, not having any sense of how to responsibly consume. I don't want to see us make similar mistakes when it comes to cannabis. And I think you've started to see some good moves in that direction. Colorado, for instance, has a responsible, not responsible consumption, but a responsible approach to cannabis marketing campaign of their own for the state that talks to parents and to kids somewhat candidly, at least as candidly as you can expect from a state marketing campaign. And I think that we need to continue to look for opportunities to teach kids about it without going to the extremes of something like the propaganda we all got from the DARE program, but without downplaying the fact that there are risks involved, especially for younger people, and that they need to take responsibility for reducing those risks if they are moving towards consuming.
That's great. Taylor, thank you so much. This conversation has been awesome. We hope you'll come back.
I really appreciate you guys having me on.
Please check out Taylor's work at COHNNABIS.com, COHNNABIS.com. We'll stick a link in the show notes. And you can always find her popping in to the Marijuana Today podcast, which is also equally awesome. As for us, if you want to chat with us, find us on Instagram and Twitter with the handle KCSA_cannabis, or drop Lewis some hate mail at greenrush@kcsa.com.
Hate mail!
And don't forget to subscribe to the Green Rush in your favorite podcatcher.
Oh, and by the way,
again, Taylor,
3 years from now, we are so holding you to what you just said.
Marking my calendar.
Indeed. Let us all hope that my optimistic projection is right.
Love it.
That was one take, Shay. One take.
Cannabis! Cannabis!